The Napoleonic Wars were a series of major conflicts pitting the French Empire, led by Emperor Napoleon I, against an array of European powers formed into various coalitions. They revolutionized European armies and played out on an unprecedented scale, mainly owing to the application of modern mass conscription. The wars are traditionally seen as a continuation of the Revolutionary Wars, which broke out in 1792 during the French Revolution. Initially, French power rose quickly as the armies of Napoleon conquered much of Europe. In his military career, Napoleon fought about 60 battles and lost 7, mostly at the end of his reign. The Great French Dominion collapsed rapidly after the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. Napoleon was defeated in 1814, and then once more in 1815 at Waterloo after a brief return to power. The Allies then reversed all French gains since the Revolutionary Wars at the Congress of Vienna. Before a final victory against Napoleon, 5 of 7 coalitions saw defeat at the hands of France. France defeated the First and Second Coalitions during the French Revolutionary Wars, the Third, the Fourth and the Fifth Coalition under the leadership of Napoleon. These great victories gave the French army a sense of invulnerability, especially when it approached Moscow. But after the retreat from Russia, in spite of incomplete victories, France was defeated by the Sixth Coalition at Leipzig, in the Peninsular War at Vittoria and at the hands of the Seventh Coalition at Waterloo. The wars resulted in the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire and sowed the seeds of nationalism that would lead to the consolidations of Germany and Italy later in the century. Meanwhile, the global Spanish Empire began to unravel as French occupation of Spain weakened Spain's hold over its colonies, providing an opening for nationalist revolutions in Spanish America. As a direct result of the Napoleonic Wars and the great destruction of the other great powers, the British Empire became the foremost world power for the next century, thus beginning Pax Britannica. No consensus exists about when the French Revolutionary Wars ended and the Napoleonic Wars began. An early candidate is the 9th of November 1799, the date of Bonaparte's coup seizing power in France. However, the most common date is the 18th of May 1803, when renewed war broke out between Britain and France, ending the one-year-old Peace of Amiens, the only period of general peace in Europe between 1792 and 1814. Most actual fighting ceased following Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo on the 18th of June 1815, although skirmishing continued as late as the 3rd of July 1815 at the Battle of Issy. The Second Treaty of Paris officially ended the wars on the 20th of November 1815. Background 1789 to 1802. News of the French Revolution of 1789 was received with great alarm by the rulers of France's neighbours, which only increased with the arrest and eventual execution of King Louis XVI of France. The first attempt to crush the French Republic came in 1793 when Austria, the Kingdom of Sardinia, the Kingdom of Naples, Prussia, Spain and the Kingdom of Great Britain formed the First Coalition. French measures, including general conscription, military reform, and total war, contributed to the defeat of the First Coalition. Despite the civil war occurring in France, the war ended when General Napoleon Bonaparte forced the Austrians to accept his terms in the Treaty of Campo Formio. Only Great Britain remained opposed to the French Republic. The Second Coalition was formed in 1798 by Austria, Great Britain, the Kingdom of Naples, the Ottoman Empire, the Papal States, Portugal, Russia, Sweden and other countries. During the War of the Second Coalition, the French Republic suffered from corruption and internal division under the Directory. France also lacked funds, and no longer had the services of Lazare Carnot, the war minister who had guided it to successive victories following extensive reforms during the early 1790s. Bonaparte, the main architect of victory in the last years of the First Coalition, had gone to campaign in Egypt, missing 2 of its most important military figures from the previous conflict. The Republic suffered successive defeats against revitalized enemies whom British financial support brought back into the war. Bonaparte returned from Egypt to France on 23 August 1799, and seized control of the French government on 9 November 1799 in the coup of 18 Brumaire, replacing the Directory with the Consulate led by himself. He reorganized the French military and created a reserve army positioned to support campaigns either on the Rhine or in Italy. On all fronts, French advances caught the Austrians off guard and knocked Russia out of the war. In Italy, Bonaparte won a notable victory against the Austrians at Marengo in 1800, but the decisive win came at Hohenlinden later that year. The defeated Austrians left the conflict after the Treaty of Lunéville, forcing Britain to sign the Peace of Amiens with France. Start date and nomenclature. No consensus exists as to when the French Revolutionary Wars ended and the Napoleonic Wars began. Possible dates include the 9th of November 1799, when Bonaparte seized power on 18 Brumaire in France, or the 18th of May 1803, when Britain and France ended the one short period of peace between 1792 and 1814, or the 2nd of December 1804, when Bonaparte crowned himself emperor. British historians occasionally refer to the nearly continuous period of warfare from 1792 to 1815 as the Great French War, or as the final phase of the Anglo-French Second Hundred Years' War, spanning the period 1689 to 1815. In France, the Napoleonic Wars are generally integrated with the French Revolutionary Wars. Les guerres de la Révolution et de l'Empire. Napoleon's tactics. Napoleon was, and remains, famous for his battlefield victories, and historians have spent enormous attention in analyzing them. In 2008, Donald Sutherland wrote, "The ideal Napoleonic battle was to manipulate the enemy into an unfavorable position through maneuver and deception, force him to commit his main forces and reserve to the main battle, and then undertake an enveloping attack with uncommitted or reserved troops on the flank or rear. Such a surprise attack either would produce a devastating effect on morale or force him to weaken his main battle line. Either way, the enemy's own impulsiveness began the process by which even a smaller French army could defeat the enemy's forces one by one." After 1807, Napoleon's creation of a highly mobile, well-armed artillery force gave artillery usage increased tactical importance. Napoleon, rather than relying on infantry to wear away the enemy's defenses, now could use massed artillery as a spearhead to pound a break in the enemy's line. Once that was achieved, he sent in infantry and cavalry. Prelude. Britain was irritated by a number of French actions following the Treaty of Amiens. Bonaparte had annexed Piedmont and Elba, made himself president of the Italian Republic, a state in northern Italy that France had set up, and failed to evacuate Holland. France continued to interfere with British trade despite peace having been made, and complained about Britain harboring certain individuals and not cracking down on their anti-French press. Malta had been captured by Britain during the war and was subject to a complex arrangement in the 10th article of the Treaty of Amiens, where it was to be restored to the Knights of St. John with a Neapolitan garrison and placed under the guarantee of third powers. However, the weakening of the Knights of St. John by the confiscation of their assets in France and Spain, along with delays in obtaining guarantees, prevented the British from evacuating it after 3 months as stipulated in the treaty. The Helvetic Republic had been set up by France when they invaded Switzerland in 1798. France had withdrawn its troops, but violent strife subsequently broke out against the government, which many Swiss saw as overly centralized. Alarmed, Bonaparte reoccupied the country in October 1802 and imposed a compromise settlement. This action caused widespread outrage in Britain, who protested this as violation of the Treaty of Lunéville. Although continental powers were unprepared to act, the British decided to send an agent who would help the Swiss obtain supplies. and also sent orders for their military not to return Cape Colony to Holland as they had committed to do so in the Treaty of Amiens. Swiss resistance collapsed, however, before anything could be accomplished, and after a month Britain countermanded the orders not to restore Cape Colony. At the same time, Russia finally joined the guarantee with regards to Malta. Concerned that there would be hostilities when Bonaparte found out that Cape Colony had been retained, the British began to deliberately procrastinate on the evacuation of Malta. In January 1803, an official government paper in France published a report from a commercial agent which noted the ease with which Egypt could be conquered. The British seized on this to demand some sort of satisfaction and security before evacuating Malta, which was a convenient stepping stone to Egypt. France disclaimed any desire to seize Egypt and asked what sort of satisfaction was required, but the British were unable to give a response. There was still no thought of going to war. Prime Minister Addington publicly affirmed Britain was in a state of profound peace. In early March 1803, the Addington ministry received word that Cape Colony had been reoccupied by the British Army in accordance with the orders, which had subsequently been countermanded. On 8 March they ordered military preparations to guard against possible French retaliation, but publicly justified him by falsely claiming that it was only in response to French preparations and that they were conducting serious negotiations with France. In a few days it was known that Cape Colony had been surrendered in accordance with the counter-orders, but it was too late. Bonaparte berated the British ambassador in front of 200 spectators over its unjustified military preparations. The Addington ministry realized they would face an inquiry over their false reasons for the military preparations, and during the month of April unsuccessfully attempted to secure the support of William Pitt the Younger to shield them from damage. That same month the ministry suddenly issued an ultimatum to France demanding the retention of Malta for at least 10 years, the permanent acquisition of the island of Lampedusa from the Kingdom of Sicily, and the evacuation of Holland. In addition, they offered to recognize French gains in Italy if they evacuated Switzerland, and compensated the King of Sardinia for his territorial losses. France offered to place Malta in the hands of Russia to satisfy British concerns, pull out of Holland when Malta was evacuated, and form a convention to give satisfaction to Britain on other issues. The British falsely denied that Russia had made an offer, and their ambassador left Paris. Desperate to avoid war, Bonaparte sent a secret offer where he agreed to let Britain retain Malta if France could occupy the Otranto Peninsula in Naples. All efforts were futile and Britain declared war on 18 May 1803. War between Britain and France, 1803 to 1814. British motivations. Britain ended the uneasy truce created by the Treaty of Amiens when it declared war on France in May 1803. The British were increasingly angered by Napoleon's reordering of the international system in Western Europe, especially in Switzerland, Germany, Italy and the Netherlands. Kagan argues that Britain was insulted and alarmed especially by Napoleon's assertion of control over Switzerland. Britons felt insulted when Napoleon said it deserved no voice in European affairs, and ought to shut down the London newspapers that were vilifying Napoleon. Britain had a sense of loss of control, as well as loss of markets, and was worried by Napoleon's possible threat to its overseas colonies. Macklin argues that Britain went to war in 1803 out of a mixture of economic motives and national neuroses, an irrational anxiety about Napoleon's motives and intentions. However, Macklin concludes that in the long run it proved to be the right choice for Britain, because in the long run Napoleon's intentions were hostile to British national interest. Furthermore, Napoleon was not ready for war, and this was the best time for Britain to stop them. Britain therefore seized upon the Malta issue, refusing to follow the terms of the Treaty of Amiens and evacuate the island. The deeper British grievance was their perception that Napoleon was taking personal control of Europe, making the international system unstable, and forcing Britain to the sidelines. Numerous scholars have argued that Napoleon's aggressive posture made him numerous enemies while costing potential allies. The Continental powers as late as 1808 affirmed most of his remarkable gains and titles, but the continuing conflict with Britain led him to start the Peninsular War and the invasion of Russia, which many scholars see as a dramatic miscalculation. There was one serious attempt to negotiate peace with France during the war, made by Charles James Fox in 1806. The British wanted to retain their overseas conquests and have Hanover restored to George III in exchange for accepting French conquests on the continent. The French were willing to confirm Malta, Cape Colony, Tobago, and French Indian posts to Britain, but wanted to obtain Sicily in exchange for the restoration of Hanover, a condition the British refused. Unlike its many coalition partners, Britain remained at war throughout the period of the Napoleonic Wars. Protected by naval supremacy, Britain maintained low-intensity land warfare on a global scale for over a decade. The British government paid out large sums of money to other European states, so that they could pay armies in the field against France. These payments are colloquially known as the Golden Cavalry of St. George. The British Army provided long-term support to the Spanish rebellion in the Peninsular War of 1808 to 1814, assisted by Spanish guerrilla tactics. Anglo-Portuguese forces under Arthur Wellesley supported the Spanish, which campaigned successfully against the French armies, eventually driving them from Spain, thus allowing Britain to invade southern France. By 1815, the British Army played the central role in the final defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo. Beyond minor naval actions against British imperial interests, the Napoleonic Wars were much less global in scope than preceding conflicts such as the 7 Years' War, which historians term a «world war». Economic warfare in response to the naval blockade of the French coasts enacted by the British government on 16 May 1806. Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree on 21 November 1806, which brought into effect the Continental System. This policy aimed to eliminate the threat from Britain by closing French-controlled territory to its trade. Britain maintained a standing army of just 220,000 at the height of the Napoleonic Wars, of which less than half was available for campaigning, the rest being necessary for garrisoning Ireland and the colonies or providing security for England, whereas France's strength peaked at around 2,500,000 full-time and part-time soldiers, including several hundred thousand National Guardsmen that Napoleon could draft into the military if necessary. Both nations also enlisted large numbers of sedentary militia, but they were unsuited for actual campaigning and were mostly employed to release regular forces for active duty. The Royal Navy effectively disrupted France's extra-continental trade, both by seizing and threatening French shipping and by seizing French colonial possessions, but could do nothing about France's trade with the major continental economies and posed little threat to French territory in Europe. Also, France's population and agricultural capacity far outstripped that of Britain. However, Britain had the greatest industrial capacity in Europe, and its mastery of the seas allowed it to build up considerable economic strength through trade. That sufficed to ensure that France could never consolidate its control over Europe in peace. However, many in the French government believed that cutting Britain off from the continent would end its economic influence over Europe and isolate it. Financing the war. A key element in British success was its ability to mobilize the nation's industrial and financial resources and apply them to defeating France. With a population of 16 million, Britain was half the size of France with 30 million. In terms of soldiers, the French advantage was offset by British subsidies that paid for a large proportion of the Austrian and Russian soldiers, peaking at about 450,000 men in 1813. By the terms of the Anglo-Russian Agreement of 1803, Britain paid a subsidy of 1.5 million liras for every 100,000 Russian soldiers in the field. Most important, the British national output remained strong and the well-organized business sector channeled products into what the military needed. Britain used its economic power to expand the Royal Navy, doubling the number of frigates and increasing the number of large ships of the line by 50%, while increasing the roster of sailors from 15,000 to 133,000 in 8 years after the war began in 1793. France, meanwhile, saw its navy shrink by more than half. The system of smuggling finished products into the continent undermined French efforts to ruin the British economy by cutting off markets. Subsidies to Russia and Austria kept them in the war. The British budget in 1814 reached £66 million, including £10 million for the Royal Navy, £40 million for the Army, £10 million for the Allies, and £38 million as interest on the national debt. The national debt soared to £679 million, more than double the GDP. It was willingly supported by hundreds of thousands of investors and taxpayers, despite the higher taxes on land and a new income tax. The whole cost of the war came to £831 million. By contrast, the French financial system was inadequate and Napoleon's forces had to rely in part on requisitions from conquered lands.